I want to hand things over now to our speaker. We're so excited to have her. Sophie Lewis is theorist, critic, translator, and author of Full Surrogacy Now. And I'm going to pass things over to her.
I'd like to open by saying that offering these thoughts in support of the strike is a privilege and an honor, that I have confidence the strike will win, both on its current terms and in ways as yet unknown and unthought, and that I support, in the meantime, your righteous demand for an immediate COLA for all and all your other demands in full and retroactive, and that I'm in real appreciation for Tom and Molly for their efforts in putting this strike university together, filling it with incredible speakers, and then inviting and including me. Amidst the turmoil of COVID, unsurprisingly, oracular thinkers of the home and household seem to suddenly be in high demand. Speaking purely from personal experience, it seems that a number of commissioning editors are currently coming from a place of sudden quarantine-induced realization that the nuclear family might in fact really suck, which means they are desirous for speculation about what happens next for the family. Will 2020, the year of isolation, dialectically mark the beginning of the end of human isolation, the overthrow of gender qua-division of labor, the overthrow of work? Will we see a sort of mushrooming archipelago of protest kitchens morphing into a million co-housing projects, co-ops and communes? Will all the cleaners, nannies, wet nurses, babysitters, gardeners, sex workers, cooks, au pairs, and chauffeurs of the present move into their employers' choicest wings, adding their names to the property deeds, the car insurance documents, the children's birth certificates? Will children themselves advance their liberation, emancipating themselves in the name of chosen survival, and together develop their vision of democratic transgenerational cohabitation? Will a vast new federated institution of social care spring up, a creche for people of all ages, perhaps, as one 21st century feminist communist proposal has it, devoted to the principle that we are all the makers of one another and we could learn collectively to act like it? Well, as I've flippantly told all the social democratic magazines, the answer is an inevitable yes. But let me back up a bit and give some context. It was about 14 months ago now that Verso launched my book, Molly mentioned, Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family. And it's a call for the gestational commune, which I hoped might contribute to a revival of queer utopianism inspired by the Marxist rallying cry, abolish the family. And actually, for several years now, together with a number of other trans-liberationist Marxists and mothers, notably Michelle O'Brien, Kate Doyle-Griffiths, Madeline Lane McKinley, and Jules Gleason, I have been doing my best to raise the profile again of that old dream, family abolition, to clarify what it is and is not, and to restore the private, i.e. repronormative or patriarchal nuclear household to its proper place as the principal object of feminist and queer radical critique. So here the thing to stress is that critique really means critique, recognition that the family is simultaneously an anti-queer factory for producing productive workers, rife with power asymmetries and violence. It's the site for the vast majority of certain categories of violence in this world. And at the same time, the sole source of love, care, and protection against the brutalization of the police, the market, work, and racism that many of us have got. Our idea is the positive supersession, right, of presently existing family forms, And this means, in large part, to quote O'Brien, the preservation and emancipation of the genuine love and care that proletarian people have found with each other in the midst of hardship, the fun and joy of eroticism, the intimacy of parenting and romance. Or, as Sophie Silverstein clarifies in Open Democracy, thinking about organizing intimacy and care beyond the family is less about taking away safety and coziness than it is about extending those very same conditions to everyone, regardless of how they live and love. The goal is a society where mutual nurturance and support are not dependent on a genetic lottery. Now, the effects of our efforts, this little group of family abolitionists in the 21st century, on the culture at large, has been difficult to gauge. For my part, I think I was most surprised not by the antipathy, but actually by the surprise that greeted our immodest proposal in all but a very few sort of tiny pockets of the left. In the 19th century, as well as the sex and gay liberationist 1970s, a call for abolishing the family in favor of a classless, poly-maternal commune was a common anti-capitalist practice. In 1892, Karl Kautsky even complained that one of the most widespread prejudices against socialism rests upon the notion that it proposes to abolish the family. So the extent of contemporary socialists' institutional forgetting of this controversy via the quashing of the radical imagination in the 80s is something I think I underestimated. Yet, besides incredulity, ridicule, and heated opposition, some of it from the white nationalist far right, the message of feminism against the family has also faced a more insidious response. Namely, there has been a liberal and bourgeois white feminist recuperation, by which I mean a centrist embrace of a superficial discourse against the nuclear family, which sort of utterly defangs its tenets. So while it may not be possible, unfortunately, to provide a walkthrough of how family abolitionism, as my friends and I see it, will transpire, what is possible, and I think perhaps useful, is to identify what this new recuperative politics calls for and why it isn't just not enough, but is potentially actively detrimental to our collective liberation. So the most obvious element of this popular discourse I've noticed is the sort of folksy sense in which nobody can disagree that it takes a village to make a child, right? And like, to be sure, any discussion of the blackmail, overwork, and scarcity that private households breed, as well as the falsity of their claim to being autonomous organisms, is probably a good thing. Like, guess what? Care labor, both commodified and uncommodified, directly and indirectly market mediated, is always flowing into a home, a bourgeois home, from myriad outside sources. In a recent article in Slate on parenting under COVID, titled "The Nuclear Family is Not Enough," one journalist correctly writes, quote, "The irony of the American nuclear family ideal, so near and dear to advertisers and politicians, is that having a kid usually teaches you that it's not real," unquote. And in The Guardian, another journalist agrees a few days later, quote, "This pandemic has exposed the myth of the nuclear family," unquote. While paradoxically, quote, "We have gone back to the ground zero notion that it exists," unquote. So, all right, but who is this we that requires the experience of procreation or of losing access to the supports of the school system, commercial cleaning, and or child minding to come to the realization that the nuclear household is a kind of emperor's new clothes situation. I mean, I obviously agree that the nuclear family is a disciplinary image, and to be specific, an ideology of self-reproducing whiteness that packages a radically more promiscuous material reality. In fact, I sometimes give full family now as an alternative title for my book for this reason. And I talk about the dialectic of real families against the family, in particular of colonized kin against the colonial state. However, it's one thing to notice that what one had thought were supports, commodified and not, propping up one's family, that they are in fact integral to its functioning. And it is another to recognize that this disciplinary image elevates some lives while devaluing others and needs to be destroyed, not just sort of skeptically critiqued in the pages of The Guardian. There are real bloody consequences to keeping this disciplinary image of the family, which creates a legal as well as symbolic hierarchy of identities in place. There are bloody consequences to simply criticizing it mildly while ultimately naturalizing it. We can look to the usual sites of societal suffering to see the human cost of governmental health departments making a norm of the private nuclear household, particularly during a pandemic. Working class and sex working communities, drug using communities, queer and trans communities, and Black communities where children tend to circulate between homes in constellations. One investigative reporter, Danny McLean, recently outlined how Black co-parents are having to adapt self-quarantine guidelines to their own multi-household situations. And Black Americans are by far, as we know, the hardest hit by the pandemic, the most violently brutalized by the police for defying stay-at-home directives. The nuclear family is also rarer to the extent that it exists anywhere in Black America, partly because it does not support Black thriving, having been explicitly installed in America, as Hortense Spillers lays out in Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, to distinguish whites from chattel slaves for white supremacist purposes. During this 21st century pandemic, then, the very source of marginalized groups' survival in the wake of slavery, i.e. their counter-familial kinning strategies and generational overlap across multiple homes, seems to be part of what has confounded the biopolitical rationality of medical authorities, leading to institutional neglect and a tragic headcount. And that's why I would love to have a conversation about the ways in which liberalism, including liberal feminism, might seek to truncate, co-opt, and neutralize the revolutionary feminist content of family abolitionist desires. If the commentariat of today has a new penchant for criticizing the nuclear family, in most cases, these criticisms are still animated by a structurally anti-Black, no doubt unconscious, contempt for forms of chosen family that eschew marriage. There is enormous enthusiasm from some white pundits for the notion of extended family, in other words, as long as what that means is building out a web of respectable civic relationships around a proper marital genealogical core that can ensure prosperity. Basically, some public thinkers are now slamming the nuclear family, carefully defined as a single generational living unit rather than a property logic, the better to guard against more radical contestations of bourgeois reproduction. And the best known example of this is probably when in February of this year, The Atlantic published a 9,000 word feature by the New York Times columnist David Brooks entitled "The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake." And that piece is actually a case study in liberal racism and marriage fundamentalism, draping lip service to forged kinships among tribes in Micronesia around a litany of excuse making for the, quote, chaos of contemporary Black life. Sick, right? If the US, he says, returned to the marriage rates of 1970, child poverty would be 20% lower, as though marriage were what makes children poor. Brooks's article mounts a plea for our, implicitly white, civilization to return to the extended family based on marriage for capitalism's sake. Americans in general became individualistic in the leftist 1960s, he contends. Consequently, they are nowadays less willing to sacrifice self for the sake of the family. Brooks wishes his peers, in particular, would stop being so hypocritical and stand up for what they really harbor in their souls. Quote, highly educated progressives may talk a tolerant game on family structure when speaking about society at large, but they have extremely strict expectations for their own families, unquote. But lest you detect any moralism at work, Brooks explains towards the end of his piece that he, and presumably also his wife, were long part of a, quote, forged family in DC, in that they participated in dinners organized by their friends Kathy and David's not-for-profit, All Our Kids. The idea has been taken and run with by other versions of David Brooks, for instance, at the Washington Post, where a recent article was entitled, quote, "The coronavirus might break the nuclear family. That wouldn't be a bad thing." The plan, whose neoliberal sort of purport is difficult to miss, is that, quote, Americans should reclaim the joys, advantages, burdens, and pains of multi-generational living, unquote. In Brooks, the nostalgia is also explicit and unapologetic, namely for the time when, quote, sisters-in-law shouted greetings across the street at each other from their porches. So, what must we say to this? It's in one sense kind of simple what we have to say. No, fuck you. This is not what we mean. This is a recuperative rescue of a source of near infinite free labor, by the capitalist state. Of course they want old and young to live together under one roof in a moment of crisis without changing anything about marriage or the genetic basis of custody, the legal and resource gatekeeping structures that order filial life, and among other things, dispossess many hundreds of thousands of queer youths, all the time. It is the hierarchy and the property ideology embedded in the ideology of biogenetics that has to go. There can be no family abolition without the abolition of inheritance, or indeed class, and indeed private property. There can be no family abolition without children's liberation, without prison abolition, without abolition of the police. So while the middle and upper classes in this moment may be experiencing local coronavirus lockdowns as a kind of loose, unevenly distributed form of house arrest, requiring think pieces in praise of extended family. Many indigenous, poor, unemployed, and working class people are, by necessity as well as choice, pooling their resources, opening their homes to the houseless, forming homeschooling hubs and mini creches, and holding their bosses to ransom. With every act of COVID-era stranger solidarity, with every expropriation of a hotel to shelter the evicted or the sick, with every anti-deportation action, every prison protest, and every riot for Black lives, it becomes clearer, quote unquote, family values are not what's called for in this situation. Treat your neighbors as family is a very popular and well-meaning sentiment. And it's also, by the way, the slogan of David Brooks's social fabric project, which is called Weave, trademark. It happens to be utterly wrong. If we want to make it into the next century as a species worthy of the name human, we will have to do much better than that. Be it as a biologistic ideology, a fiction of political economy, or a metaphor, it is blindingly obvious family is failing us. And if anything, after COVID, if there is such a thing, we must never treat each other like family again. We must treat each other instead with all the tenderness and responsibility due to strangers, or dare I say, comrades. And this ethos of xeno-hospitality, as Helen Hester calls it, right? A care for the alien and openness to the stranger. This ethos, here's the next part of a dialectic, applies to our mothers too. And this is why the old distinction between mothering and motherhood, between the ontological notion mother and the processual one, I'm sort of proposing we might call motherer, is so crucial. Mothers have, after all, historically both brought down oppressive regimes and built them. On the one hand, maternal feminists, maternalist activists, and femo-nationalists, so-called mothers of the nation, have served for centuries as prime movers of world systemic evils, such as white supremacy, spearheading imperial and settler colonial projects of racial uplift and eugenics. And on the other, as queer Black feminists such as Alexis Pauline Gumbs lay out, dispossessed mamas, mammies, other mothers, that's one word, and queer motherers have consistently posed a formidable threat to capitalism and the state. And that dialectic in question is, again, as Black and Indigenous feminisms have had to point out, more properly articulated not as a contradiction in the soul of every mother, but as a structural matter of colonially imposed scarcity, a matter of planetary whiteness and its abolition, a matter of the war between social reproduction from below and class society's reproduction from above, a matter of motherhood's very invention and design as an institution to render indigenous and formerly enslaved people less than fully human. So I happen to have done a handful of events in the past week, all of them quite different, and all of them actually recorded and available online for you to watch should anything I'm saying right now not make any sense or feels like it needs complementing or context. In one of them, I tried to talk about the category-defying labor of gestating or pregnancy itself, and why that labor is so useful for better framing, which is to say chiefly de-romanticizing the much broader labor of care. And in another, I talk more about the queer Black radical critique of kinship and the gender binary, the dialectic of mothering against motherhood, and the question of mothering against the world. Mothering and comradeliness being the two concepts I use to define the many-gendered collective practice of care. I talk about Alexis Shotwell's important critique that white people in the US context in particular must claim their bad kin and cannot simply adopt indigenous processes of relationality for themselves. And last Thursday, I was one of the people representing the writing collective Out of the Woods, discussing our new book, Out with Common Notions, Hope Against Hope, Writings on Ecological Crisis. And we talked there, among other things, about abolitionist care, survival pending abolition, seizing the means of ecological regeneration, and a queer cyborg ecology predicated on disaster communism and mutual aid. Today, I thought it important that we leave time to discuss COVID, but also the riots in the name of the stolen life of George Floyd. After all, not only the pandemic, but also the Black riots in Minneapolis speak directly to the matter of abolishing the private nuclear family, which is an institution designed to individualize and privatize all socially reproductive labor, including the care for the sick. But also, as I've sort of mentioned a few times, it's an institution invented, again, Hortense Spillers is the best on this, specifically in the image of whiteness and in contradistinction to the genderless, kinless bodies that were being produced in the same moment, notably on the American slave plantation. But I should say there is absolutely no need for us to link to the question of abolishing the family in our discussion of the present moment and the free form conversation that I hope we can spend the remaining time on. But just to conclude, I would like to throw it over to you for thinking about, asking you to focus on this one specific aspect of the tangle of interrelated dialectics that is full surrogacy now, namely this question of feminism and what the hell that is, and why and how it has been, or is, or can be, or should be against the family. What is the best definition of the family from feminism? What are the valid reasons why feminists have rejected the idea of family abolition? Because for me, and this is the simplest way I can put this, even if plenty of feminism is antithetical to the cause, for me, feminism in the sense of communism is one of the truest names of family abolition. For me, you know, even if the founders of Wages for Housework do not say so, Wages for Housework is a statement of family abolitionism. And for me, even if the Black radicals in the tradition of Audre Lorde and Hortense Spillers do not choose this nomenclature, their work is a spur to abolishing the family for me. So yeah, obviously since the beginning of coronavirus lockdown, these kinds of important genealogies, sources, ancestors, particularly around the realities of the human body's interconnectedness and private property's racial structure and its deathliness, have become a bit more cognitively inescapable, I think. It caught my attention that doctors in the before time, you know, occasionally used to prescribe food, money, companionship, abuse-free shelter, a holiday from housewifehood to their patients. And today, the concepts of reproductive justice, of family inequality, of compulsory domesticity, of the right to the city have taken on even more force. I'm going to conclude there And thank you very much once again for your attention.